were just children, some barely out of diapers, while others were old enough to steal a crust of bread or disappear into alleyways before the cops came. They came from New York, Boston, Chicago, sprawling cities bloated with poverty, disease, and desperation. Then, one by one, they were put on trains with their names scrawled on paper tags, sent far from the only world they knew to farms and small towns across the Midwest, to strangers, to places they couldn't even pronounce, and to families they had never met. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 children were shipped across the country on what became known as the Orphan Trains. It was called a grand social experiment, a chance for abandoned and impoverished kids to find new homes and new lives. But for many, or even most, it was a gamble. Some found warmth and belonging. Others found heartbreak, abuse, or endless days of hard farm labor. This is the forgotten story of America's lost children, a chapter of heartbreak and hope, of cruelty and resilience, a chapter that shaped a nation, one child at a time. Mid-19th century America was a brutal place to be poor, and an even harder place to be young. Cities like New York were teeming with newcomers, immigrants fresh off the boat, widows struggling to raise families. After the Irish potato famine, after the Civil War, after countless outbreaks of typhoid, cholera, and yellow fever, tens of thousands of children were left parentless or simply abandoned, not because their families didn't love them, but because poverty, disease, and addiction gave them no other choice. By the 1850s, an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 homeless children wandered the streets of New York. To put that in context, that was roughly 1 out of every 50 people in a city of 500,000. Police beat them up, while criminals exploited them. Newspapers called them street rats, and politicians called them dangerous. But one man refused to accept this. Charles Loring Brace, a quiet, stubborn minister, walked the filthy streets of New York and saw something different. Not ruin nor pests. In those ragged, frightened faces, he saw possibility. And in the heart of a city that had forgotten its children, he launched an experiment, one that would carry tens of thousands of little souls across the continent and redefine what childhood meant in a growing, struggling nation. Charles Loring Brace came to New York in the early 1850s, and what he found shook him to the core. Thousands upon thousands of children with nowhere to go, nowhere to sleep, nowhere to belong. To most, they were a threat or an inconvenience. However, to Brace, they were a challenge. And instead of turning away, he decided to act. In 1853, he founded the Children's Aid Society. At first, it was modest, a place where vagrant boys could find a bed, a bite to eat, and maybe a lesson or a prayer. The first year, the society offered religious instruction, basic education, and a roof over the heads of street Arabs, as the newspapers called the city's orphans. But the need was overwhelming. The streets weren't just swallowing up dozens of kids every month, it was swallowing hundreds. That's when Brace came up with an idea that was bold, desperate, and dangerous. What if these kids weren't meant to live in the city at all? What if their chance for a better life was somewhere else? To Brace, rural America was a refuge, an antidote to the disease, poverty, and crime of New York. He believed that honest, hard-working farmers needed help, What better way to solve both problems than to send the city's abandoned children west, out to farms and small towns? So, the Children's Aid Society began rounding up the little ones. They dressed them in donated clothes, clipped paper tags with names and ages to their jackets, and put them on a train, not as criminals, not as outcasts, but as hopeful strangers and as candidates for belonging. That first official journey came in September 1844. Dozens of children, shy, frightened, but hopeful, waved goodbye to the only world they'd ever known. They were bound for farms and families across the Midwest. The press would later call it an orphan train, though that name wouldn't gain common usage until much later. Even the term was misleading, because not every child was an orphan, and not every child had come from the streets. Some had living mothers and fathers too sick, too poor, or too broken to raise them. Others had run away from abuse or ended up in the program because a parent decided a fresh start out west was better than a slow death in a tenement. The Children's Aid Society called it outplacement, finding new homes for children who had none. In fact, New York itself remained one of the biggest destinations for orphan train children. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut weren't far behind. The reality, however, was more complex than the myth. Not every boy or girl was shipped across the plains, but for many, that paper tag became a second chance. But for Brace and the volunteers of the Children's Aid Society, it was worth trying. It was the beginning of a bold, controversial chapter in American history, a chapter that shaped the way the nation treated its lost and abandoned. And for better or worse, it started with this single but dangerous idea. What if you could take thousands of abandoned kids and ship them across the country, not to orphanages, nor to prisons, but to families, to towns they had never heard of? The experience was terrifying. For many of these kids, it started with a tag clipped to a shirt and a long walk down a crowded train platform. Each stop felt like a grim auction. A man would stand on a box and call out to the gathering crowd, "This one's a strong boy, good for farm work. This girl is quiet, she'll help with the babies." Then came the inspection. Their teeth were checked, arms flexed, and skin scanned. They weren't called by their names anymore, just by what they could do and what work they might be worth. Some siblings were kept together, however. Most weren't so lucky. 8-year-old Emma Huber cried as she watched her younger brother pulled away by a couple in Iowa. And she never saw him again. 12-year-old John Brady was adopted by a wealthy judge in Nebraska and would one day rise to become governor of Alaska. He was one of the lucky ones. But for every John Brady, countless others weren't as fortunate. Some were treated as cherished sons and daughters. Others were treated like beasts of burden, beaten, starved, worked until their tiny hands bled. And here's the bitter truth. There were no background checks, no formal home studies, and no serious follow-ups. Most of the children weren't even allowed to complain. They didn't know how. The very first group departed New York in October 1854. 45 frightened children, bound for Dowagiac, Michigan. The conditions were harsh. The journey was long and exhausting. The man in charge was E.P. Smith of the Children's Aid Society. His job was to match these orphans with families. Yet even he was careless. Once in Dowagiac, Smith worked the crowd like a salesman, reminding them that boys are handy and girls can be used for housework. According to official stories, Would-be adoptive families needed recommendations from their pastor and a local justice of the peace. But in reality, those rules were often ignored or treated like a formality. By the end of that first day, 15 boys and girls had been placed with local families. 5 days later, another 22 were claimed. The rest, 8 exhausted, frightened children, were put on another train bound for Iowa City. There, a Reverend C.C. Townsend tried to find them foster families. It was called a success, so much so that in January 1855, the Children's Aid Society sent out 2 more parties of homeless children to Pennsylvania. An idea that started as an experiment became a movement. What had been a desperate attempt to save a handful of street Arabs became a machine that would carry roughly 250,000 children across America over the next 75 years. For some, the Orphan Trains offered belonging they'd never have found in a crowded tenement or alleyway. For others, it was a sentence to a life of servitude, heartbreak, or terror. And for countless more, it was a gamble with everything they had left. A gamble that shaped the lives of generations. And not every child who stepped onto an orphan train came away broken. Some found the thing they longed for most: a home, a chance, and a name. Marion Clark was one of those rare stories. Adopted by a Kansas family, she would later say, "They gave me a Bible, a warm bed, and a mother who kissed me good night." Andrew Burke, an orphan from New York, was taken in by a farm family in Indiana. Against all odds, he grew up to become the governor of North Dakota, living proof that belonging can turn a lost boy into a man who shapes a state. But for every story like theirs, countless others sank quietly into the dark. To this day, no one knows how many ended up as free farmhands, working until their hands bled. Some refused to acknowledge the boy or girl they once were, while some searched for their birth families for decades, hoping for a name, a place, a fragment of belonging, only to find a trail gone cold. As the West was settled and communities started finding their own footing, the need for orphan train riders began to fade. Cities like Chicago, Cleveland, and St. Louis, which had once watched helplessly as New York and Boston shipped out their unwanted children, began grappling with the same crisis closer to home. New state laws emerged, and in places like Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Minnesota, and Nebraska, new regulations barred the placement of out-of-state children, unless charities put down hefty bonds guaranteeing these young lives wouldn't become a public charge. By the late 1920s, as these agreements expired and charities shifted their focus to supporting families in crisis, the orphan trains came to an end. New child welfare laws reshaped the approach to care, making it possible for the first time for many struggling families to stay together. Even when the orphan trains stopped running in 1929 as social work evolved and new child welfare laws came into force, the scars didn't vanish. The emotional toll of that era lived on. Newspapers from the era spoke openly of the spectacle. In Grand Island, Nebraska, one paper announced the arrival of a fresh group of orphans with almost festive precision. Some ordered boys, others girls, some preferred light babies, others dark, and the orders were filled out properly, and every new parent was delighted. They weren't choosing a child, they were filling an order. Behind those polite words was a brutal truth. The orphan trains weren't about sentiment, they were about survival, about making space for the unwanted, a society grappling with its own cruelty and doing the best it could, however flawed. And in the cracks between desperation and belonging, a generation of children was shaped. The orphan trains stopped running nearly a century ago. But for those, the wandering, hopeful, frightened children, the remnants never really disappeared. Today, very few remember the orphan trains. The last known rider passed away in 2017, but the echoes remain in old photographs, in forgotten letters, and in the quiet questions passed down through generations. They were children who wanted to be held, be wanted, and to simply belong. Instead, they were put on a train and carried into an unknown future. We owe it to them to remember, because the forgotten are still a part of us. And here, on Forgotten Felonies, we'll never stop telling their stories. But what do you think? Did the orphan trains save lives or bury too many stories along the way? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, stories from the shadowed corners of American history, make sure to check out our previous video.